guys, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kideshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Barevna Adonai Eloheinu et divrei Toratcha b'finu b'fimcha beit Yisrael, v'ni anachnu b'tzei etzenu b'tzei etzeimcha beit Yisrael. Kulanu yodei shemecha v'lemdei Toratech lishma Baruch atah Adonai hamlemei Torah le'amo Yisrael.
Amen.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher b'cha banu mikol hamim v'natan lanu Torato. Baruch atah Adonai noten Torah.
Amen.
Hashem blesses and is pleased with our Torah learning. What I wanted to tell you is that we're doing a review of these next 5 days until we hit the 100th year, and that is a point by point, just quick summary of the daf. Now, I wanted to be have a little bit of integrity when doing it, and that way I wanted to prepare. So the first thing is that some of these notes that I've got were prepared by Rabbi Pesach Feldman of Kula Iyon Hadaf in Yerushalayim, and then the Rosh Kula Rabbi Mordechai Cornfield, who is a very big known person. And I thought the least I could do was prepare. So what happened is I started at daf number 2a, which it starts, and I finished until 9a yesterday and Friday night. So I went through 7 daf. Not so easy in the Shabbos. 7. So I needed to, because you can't rely on the fact that you think you remember. So what I'm saying is that this takes work, and you deserve to have somebody well prepared for you. So I'm going to get started. We're going to get started with the Mishnah Berurah quickly, and I'm not doing it to boast. If I was boast, I'd say I'm boasting about my memory. I just did good old-fashioned hard work, which is nothing to boast about at all. But I needed to. All right, so guys, we're looking at the Mishnah Berurah. This is by Rabbi Daniel Brody, and 2 ways to avoid losing your benching. So basically, when you start to feel hungry, as we discussed, you may not bench anymore, but there are 2 exceptions to this. Number 1, planning to have a long meal with breaks in between, okay? So, and eating other things that extend the earlier meal. So we're going to see what this means. So planning to have long break with meals in between. Some poskim say that one only loses the benching if one never intended to continue eating later. But if one ate with intent to pause and then start again, he doesn't lose the benching, even though he became hungry in between. So I think, guys, for your safety, it's a good idea to bearing in mind that you're going to be eating later, and that way you're covered. So it has to have machshava, it has to have intent. So for example, if a person was at a wedding where you ate a big meal, and after 2 hours of dancing and chatting, you started to feel like you needed more food. According to some poskim, he has not lost the benching and can continue the meal as usual without making any brochas. Some of the other poskim say just have enough of a kazayat of bread to continue before the time stretches too long, so that you can bench at a slightly later junction. In other words, the 72-minute wait is of one opinion, and the length of time before being hungry is another. So after 60 minutes or whatever, you have a bit of a kazayat of bread so you can extend it. I think it's honestly easier just to bench, to be honest. Anyway, eating and drinking are other things that extend the earlier meal. So if you finished eating the main meal a long time ago, such that you lost your benching, but you continue to eat or drink other things like cake or nuts or drinks, you can still bench. In other words, other foods can extend a meal that usually would have been considered finished. So a person was at a long Shabbos meal and finished the main meal but did not bench, and then you started learning Torah. And 2 hours went by when you started to feel hungry. Usually he wouldn't lose the benching, but since during his learning he had nibbled at cakes or fruits or nuts, you can still bench as those things extend the meal. So this is all regarded as eating what you call a big meal, and this is from the Mishnah Berurah, section 184. Okay, so we're gonna continue. Now I must tell you something. There might be something wrong with my learning. I don't think I've learned for 2 hours where the time flies by. Let's be honest. Some things fly by quickly, some things drag. So when you're learning, it's because I'm lazy that sometimes it seems to take a long time. It doesn't like fly by the time. I don't know if it flies by for you guys.
No, not at all.
Okay.
Depends.
Well, then you must be learning at a Hamdrager, because for me it sometimes doesn't fly as much as
No.
All right, so I just want to go through the first daf, because our goal is we got 5 days. And what I want to do is I want to do a summary review of 3 dafs in one session. So in 5 sessions, we're virtually at the 15th daf and we can fly through. I'm going to do my best. Okay. Let me just start this. How long have we got? On my clock, it says 31 minutes. That can't be right. Oh, no, there's 31 minutes left. That is right. That's perfect. All right. So on the second daf, we learn about the avos nezikin, which are so the Mishnah says there are 4 primary categories of damages. You have an ox, a pit, a mave, and fire. And an ox is unlike that of the mave and vice versa. So basically, there are 4 types of damages in the Mishnah. It's the ox, the mave, the pit, and the fire. And basically what we're saying, the ox is not like the mave and the mave is not like the ox. Although they're both living, there are differences between them. And the ox and the mave, which are both living things, are not like the fire and the pit that are not living. The ox, the mave, and the fire, which are moving, are not like the pit, which is stationary. But the Mishnah says, irrespective of their unique features or their common features, if any of them damage, you're obligated to guard them, and then you are obligated to pay from your highest quality land should they damage. So now we've got a question on the first up. The first question is, if we're talking about primary damages, we then know that there's a concept of secondary damages. It's alluded to by the fact that we're putting it immediately in the category of primary. So you can think of it like in computer terms, folder and subfolder. Or an avos is known as father, or the head categories, and the tordos are known as offspring, or the subcategories, okay? So they're saying, listen, if the avos, primary categories, there must be tordos. So the question is, are the tordos like the avos or not? Are the subcategories like the primary categories or not? So then it brings in a case where they are obviously similar. And where does it bring this? It brings this in Gemara Shabbos, where it says there are 39 avos melochos, which means 39 prohibitions. And those 39 melochos, it actually describes it as 14 minus 1, were the actual activities with regards to building of the tabernacle, the Mishkan. And these are known as avos, the primary categories. And the tordos are subcategories. So let me give you an example. You've got what you call planting, which is a primary category, okay, historically, and in building of the Mishkan. Then if we water a garden, that's enhancing plant growth. So that's known as a subcategory. So that would be considered similar in thematic nature. Okay, it's the same thing when you're reaping for a harvest and you cut flowers to put on your Shabbos table. What you're doing there is curtailing plant growth. So those would be in the category of inhibiting plant growth, both the tordos and the us. Okay, I think those are fairly clear example. So basically the Mishnah is saying, what's the difference between the avos and the tordos? And the bottom line is, if somebody did 2 avos or 2 tordos or different melachos b'shoigig. So what do we mean by b'shoigig? Means in a state of unawareness. And I remember having this conversation with Gavin. There's 2 states of unawareness that can occur. What are the 2 states? Bottom line is that you can be A, unaware of Shabbos, or B, unaware that that activity is prohibited on Shabbos. How can you be unaware of Shabbos? You can say you all know how to count from Sunday to Shabbos. Well, very simple. You wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and you go to the toilet and you turn on the bathroom light, you can forget. If your phone alarm goes first thing in the morning and you forgot to switch your alarm off, you can turn your phone off and then click at Shabbos. It's not that difficult. Trust me.
Unintentional, Damon.
Yes, b'shoigeg is unintentional. That's exactly what b'shoigeg means. And these are the 2 examples, Kevin. Exactly. we use the term b'shoigeg when we're talking about an accidental death as well. So what we're saying is that if a tordor, the tordos, or the tordot, if you Sephardic, and the avos, if you do two avos or two tordos and you did it accidentally or in a state of unawareness, what happens is you have to bring two chatos offerings, two sin offerings. So it doesn't make a difference if they're two tordos, subcategories, or two primary categories. You have to bring a chatas offering, a sin offering for each one. Now the question is, if you did an oven a tordo of that same melacha, you only bring one korban. In other words, the one is that you planted seeds for the spring. Maybe you planted baby marrows, and then in a second week you watered those baby marrows, and 2 or 3 weeks later you're starting to keep Shabbos and you realize that that is prohibited. So in that particular case, because the subcategory and the primary category is involved with plant growth, and they fall within, the subcategory falls within the same category as the Av Melacha, the primary Melacha. In that case, you bring one sin offering, Kevin. One korban chatas, only one. But if you plant seeds on the 1 week, and on the other week, for example, you cut flowers to put them on your table for Shabbos, and then 2 weeks later, you're starting to keep Shabbos and realize that you've done wrong, you would bring two chatas offerings. Why? Because they're two separate categories. So what we see from here is there's no difference with the Torah and the Av in respect to the severity. Why? Because you would still bring a chatas, a sin offering, if done b'shoigeg, accidentally, inadvertently. If done on purpose, both the Av and the Tordos get the death penalty. Does that make sense? Doesn't matter if you do a subcategory or primary category. You get the death penalty if it's done on purpose with warnings, etc., and you fulfill the whole criteria. So, Rav Elazar said that in all cases, he brings a korban for every melacha. And how does he explain the difference between avos and tordos? So, Rav Elazar says the following, is that it doesn't matter whether the tordos, the subcategory, is in the same category as the av, the primary category. For example, planting seeds, which is actual planting, or the watering of a plant, which enhances plant growth. He holds that even though the subcategory conceptually mimics the primary category, you bring two different korbanim. Does that make sense? So we're saying on Rav Eliezer, we don't actually understand how does he explain the difference between an Av and a Tordo, the primary category and the subcategory. So he said that the primary category is merely historical. These were actual acts that were performed biblically to build the Mishkan, the tabernacle, whereas the Tordos are conceptually the same, but they weren't used historically. But they're as severe as each other in that you bring two korbanos. Now, all the rabbis agree that they're as severe to each other. Why? Because if you break a tordos, it's also the death penalty. They're only saying that where the primary category and subcategory is the same, in that case, b'shoigeg accidentally, you would bring one korban. Okay, so that's clear. Now, how did we get to all of this? Is we came to this because we were asking in the Mishnah of Bava Kamma that there seems to be primary categories which would infer that they're subcategories. So we're saying in the case of Bava Kamma, is it like a Mora Shabbos where the primary categories and the subcategories are as severe as each other? In other words, the penalties are the same, or the damage is the same? Or would it be where there would be more severe punishments for the primary category compared to the subcategory? And where do we see the differences? The similarity between the primary category and subcategory Shabbos. The dissimilarity or the huge difference would see in when we're learning about Tumah. So the Avos Tumah, which includes Asheret, which are rodents, that sort of thing. I'll give you an example. Certain like dead animals, such as rodents, the semen of a human male, and one who becomes tamei through a corpse. Okay, so those are considered primary categories of tumah. Now, there's what you call the primary category, which is the head of the primary category, and that is a corpse itself. Does that make sense, guys? That's the head honcho primary category. But under that is still a primary category of that who touches a corpse, semen of a human male, and a sheretz. Now, what we want to know is the torda of tumah. And we're saying is if a person that touches a dead body, we touch the person who touches a dead body, for example. Does that make sense? Or so it's one step removed. In that case, a person that touches a dead body infects the following. It affects utensils, clothing, food, and drink, and people. It affects all those things. That's an avatuma. But a person that touches a dead body only infects food and drink. It's one level less. So what we're saying here is in that case, the tordos are different to the avos because they're not as severe. Does that make sense? So, so in the category of tuma, an avatuma is much more severe than a torda, a subcategory of tuma, because it doesn't infect the same level of items. Why are we saying this? It's not about punishment. It's that the severity is less in that case, because it's one step removed from touching. So what Rav Papa is asking is in regard to Bava Kamma and Zikin, are the tordos like the others in terms of Gemara Shabbos? Are you there?
Yes.
Okay, you just were so still, I thought it was a picture. So what I was going to say is Rav Papa wants to know, is it like a Gemara Shabbos, where the avos and the tordos are the same? Or is it like the rules of Tumah, where the tordos are less severe than the avos? So what Rav Papa wants to state here is we need to learn if the subcategories are as stringent in punishment in the laws of damages compared to the primary categories. Does that make sense, guys?
Yeah.
Okay, any questions? Is it clearer the second time around, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay.
Absolutely. It's a good summary. It's very good.
All right. So now what we're going to do is we're going to hit how much have we got left, Arthur, in terms of time?
Well, we're on 24 minutes, so we've got about 16 and a half minutes left.
Fine. Let me hit the new duff. I've got the cat's tail swishing in me. Okay. So now we're talking about Keren and its Tordot. Okay. So there are three avot primary categories that pertain to an ox. The first one is Keren, which literally means the horn, and that is about the animal goring. And then the next primary category of Keren is Shane, where the animal is eating, because Shane means tooth, where the animal is eating. And the next primary category of an ox is Regel, where the animal is trampling. Okay. So you have to discern between the four primary categories in the Mishnah, which is ox, maveh, pit, and fire. Between the three primary categories of ox, which is Keren, the horn, goring, Shane, the tooth, eating, and Regel, the foot, which is trampling. So there are primary categories, except three are primary categories of the ox, and four are primary categories of the Mishnah. It's not that hard to remember. And the question is, what is the source for Keren in the Chumash? So it says if an ox will gore, goring is with the horns. Oh my gosh, the cat, sorry guys. And we learned from a brisa that he made for him horns. With these you will gore Aram, and his horns with them he will gore nations. So the question is, why are two verses needed? Okay, so if you would say that you don't learn halacha from the prophets, that you need a verse from the Torah, because remember that argument that came up. It said, listen, we're quoting multiple verses with regards to a proof of a horn biblically. And we didn't understand why. We said, why won't one suffice? So the first principle we learned from here, guys, is that halacha can only be learned from the Chumash. It can't be learned from the Ketuvim, the prophets, or the writings. That's number one. So we need a biblical source. So it says, okay, if that was the case, why don't you just bring the source from the Chumash? Why did you actually need to bring from the prophets and the writings to prove your case? So the answer is very, very simple, is that we're not firstly trying to derive halacha from the prophets, from the verse from the prophets. What we're actually trying to do is actually understand terminology. There's no problem with learning terminology. Oh, the cat, can you see the tail? So there's no problem with understanding terminology through the prophets. So what we're saying, Kevin, is as follows, is if I want to prove to you that there's a particular word of relevance, all I have to do is show you many sources where it's at. If I'm trying to prove to you what you have to keep in terms of halacha, that has to be directly from the Torah. So we're saying at this point, we just want to show you the word goring appears in different cases. And why do you need the two verses? Because the verses come to teach you something different. The one thing is to determine that you have different types of goring. You have what you call an animal that charges to gore, which is intent. In other words, the animal's charging and it has intent to damage or kill. And the other one is a point of irritation where the animal does intend to injure or kill, but it's more spontaneous as a point. Does that make sense? So those are two different types of goring. The other one is when it's kicking or squatting or smacking with its body. But in terms of goring with the horns, there's two different types. Then there's a further distinction about what we're talking about regarding horns, is that in the one example, it uses an attached horn, and the other one, it talks about a detached horn. When we talked about a detached horn, it was when they were saying that you will attack the enemies of Israel, and you'll use a detached horn. Remember, we discussed the Vikings, where they wore a helmet with horns. So we're saying, well, how is this relevant? Well, the fact of it is we're learning here about, and it's going to be addressed, the case of a tam and a muad ox. And at this point in the Gemara, we haven't learned what tam actually means. We think that tam might just be half payment, and we might say that the half payment is because the ox has got another horn in its mouth, or a dog. I told you about many years ago, the dog walked with a bone running past me and cut me. In other words, he had a detached bone in his mouth, or he had a detached horn. And let me give you an example. In animals in war, Kevin, for example, the Vikings, they used to put on their horses a horn or on their animals. And I told you that when I saw the series, The Vikings, when they start running with horns of metal on the animal to go and impale you, I would run them out. So it was a deterrent feature, and it was to protect the animal from arrows. So we might have learned that you make a tam payment, half payment, because it's a very unusual way that the animal damages, because the horn is detached. So what we learn here is we need a source to say that whether a horn was attached or detached, that there would be a tam payment if it's for the first three times. And it's not because it's the unusual damage that creates us to pay a half payment, but because the nature of the animal is either tam or murat. And it has to do with the amount of frequency that the animal is damaged, and not the unusualness of the animal damaging. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's why you need the different verses for terminology and to obviously deal with that. So if you're goring with attached horns, it's called nagicha. You've got nagifa. So nagifa is when an animal smacks you with its horns from close up. That means it's pushing with the horns. Nagicha is when an animal is charging with the horns. Okay? I had to learn that. And then we say, what are the totals of Keren? And the totals of Keren, guys, are you going to volunteer here what they are? How's your memory?
I'm hardly awake today, mate. I had a
Goring.
very rough night last night.
Goring?
No, goring is the main category.
Oh, they told us. Sorry, they told us.
All right, I think the Chazorah was not a waste of time.
I'll give you some squatting.
All right, so basically the Torahs of Keren are pushing, biting, crouching, and kicking. Now we've got to distinguish what sort of pushing we're talking about. Again, there's Nagicha and Nagifa. So Nagifa is pushing with the horns. That is considered a av of Keren because it's with the horns. Nagicha is with the charging. That's for sure the av. But even Nagifa, which is pushing with the horns, is also the primary character av. What we're talking about here is the pushing of its body with intent to damage. That is a tordal, a subcategory of Keren. But that's pushing with the body, not the horns. If it's pushing with the horns, it's still an av. So Nagicha and Nagifa are both av. It both means goring with the horns, classically. The just Nagicha is with the horn to ram and charge, and Nagifa is with pushing of the horn. When it's pushing of the body, it's a subcategory, it's a total of Keren, as well as biting, crouching, and kicking. So what we're going to learn is that biting, they'd say, isn't that shame? And we say no, because the animal intent here, when it bites, is intent to damage. Whereas in shame, the animal's biting with the teeth in order to consume food. So what we got to say is we have to look at intent. And although the physical action would mimic similarity, we're saying it's not at all the same. That in an animal is biting for injury, in that stage it's unusual damage and its intent is to injure. When an animal is shaying with the tooth, it's biting in order to consume food. And we say the same thing with kicking and squatting. We say, but this looks like regal, where the animal naturally walks and kicks or sits and squats on an object. We say, no. The intention here is that the animal is doing it in order to injure because it's irritated and that's unusual damage. And there it might look like the physical activity when it's walking, but you can definitely see the difference between the intent of the animal. Does that make sense? It's not the exact physical activity, it's the intent. Okay? And then we're learning in this particular case of the cat. Just hang on, guys. All right. Let me just see. Just hang on. So why does it bring this up? It brings it up that in a case where an animal runs to charge, it's different because man sometimes can't avoid that particular damage because he can't get out of the way in time of the speed of the animal who is trapped in there. And we learned that when an animal pushes with the body, in other words, what it's trying to say is that man is more aware of an animal. When a human being sees that an animal is aggravated, a man has got seichu, he's got intelligence, and can see that the animal's about to attack and he's got time to leave. So that's known as mazal. Mazal, according to Rashi, is the intelligence of a human being to be able to discern when an animal is angry. Okay? So we're saying that a human being is mazal, and mazla is a guardian angel. The other opinion of Rashi is that a human being is a guardian angel, in that if Hashem doesn't want that human being to be damaged, it's got extra divine protection. So in that particular case, if a tame animal gores a human 3 times, he's always muad on the 4th time for animals. But if an animal gores another animal 3 times, on the 4th time is not muad for a human being. Because a human being has got seichel and a guardian angel to protect him. It's only muad for an animal. Does that make sense? So it's trying to discern that, in other words, if it's damaged a human being more than 3 times, the animal for sure is muad both for human beings and animals. But if it's damaged an animal 3 times, on the 4th time, it's tam for a human being. It's not
muad.
I'm
not sure with you. Time for a human being.
Yes, because a human being has got 2 things going for it. It's got mazal in terms of seichel intelligence, and it's got mazla, a divine guardian angel, which Hashem doesn't want the person to leave the world unless he wants him to leave the world. So what it's saying is, if it's muad to attack animals, it doesn't mean it's muad to attack a human being. It has to attack a human being more than 3 times to be a muad for a human being. That's all it's saying.
Well, so it has to attack human beings, 3 human beings, and the 4th time it attacks a human being, it's muad. The first time it attacks a human being, it's still tam.
Correct. That's exactly it. So I just want to end on one note. We've got less than a minute. Is that Rav Papa said that some of the Tordos are unlike the Avos. Where did he refer to it? So as follows. We've studied the Tordos of Keren, and we've looked at the Av. And what we can see here is that the Tordos resemble the Av exactly.
Okay.
Why? 2 things that Keren has that makes it different from the other primary categories of the ox. What are those 2 differences? Guys.
What? With Karen?
Yeah.
Is intent.
Intent to do what?
Damage.
Good. Intent to damage or kill. That's 1. Excellent, Gavin. What's the other?
Shogeg.
No.
Oh, I thought.
It's unusual damage. Unusual damage. Gavin, you are right there. But the 2 factors that discern it in behavior is that it's unusual damage. And remember, we learned in the 17th and 16th daf about a lion or a dog or a cat's usual way to kill compared to unusual. And eating things that's fit for an animal compared to not fit for an animal. If it's the way an animal usually eats, that it's not eating clothing or utensils, then that's shame because it's physical gratification of food. But if an animal is eating clothing or utensils, not food, it's unusual, so that would be listed under Keren. So Keren has 2 features. It's unusual damage, and it's intent of the animal to kill or injure. Those are the 2 unique features.
Unusual damage is if it's like scratches or crouches. That's unusual.
No,
what's an example of it?
Okay, Kevin's asking a great question. So when an animal naturally walks in regal, every time the animal moves,
damages. Yeah.
It damages. What's
underfoot.
It can squish something that's on the side of it, like a small child. So that is so common because it's every movement an animal makes. That's the most common form of damage.
It's not intentional. It doesn't intend to damage.
But the fact of it is it's the most common because every movement the animal makes is common. So it's known as regal has got 2 unique features. It's that the way the animal naturally moves, and the fact that it's common. Every movement the animal makes will cause it to damage something that's either under its feet or squish something that's on its side. Let's look at shame. What's the characteristic of shame? Is that it's physical gratification of the animal. Is that in the animal naturally scratches its back or soils itself to relieve itself or eat something, that physical gratification is common. It's not as common as the walking because an animal doesn't eat every second or scratch every second or whatever, but it's more common than Keren. And what's the proof that it's more common than Keren? Is that if Keren was common, you wouldn't have a concept of tam and muad. It's only because it's unusual for the animal to damage that we offer that leniency. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
That's what makes Keren tam or muad. Is because it's unusual that it damages that we're lenient on the owner of the animal. Because it's uncommon. Because it's unusual. That's the leniency. Guys, am I making sense?
100%. Thanks.
So what we're learning here is let's look at the Av and the Tordos. The Tordos and the Av conceptually are the same. Again, it's unusual damage, and the animal's intention is to kill or injure. It's the object of its irritation. Okay? And because that's a fact, we see the Tordos are the same as the Av. the subcategories are the same as the primary categories, and since the subcategories are the same, this is not a case of what Rav Papa is talking about. Why? Because Rav Papa is saying that there is a case where the subcategories in the primary category is different in terms of punishment. Because we were asking in this Mishnah, is it like Shabbos, where the primary category and the subcategories are both stringent as each other, where we see that if you do it on purpose, a person gets a death penalty, whether you break Shabbos on purpose, whether it's a Av Malocha, in other words, one of the 39 Malochas, or a Torda Malocha that fits within the same category. If done on purpose, they both get the death penalty. Yeah. If it's done accidentally, each one brings a Chatas offering, whether it's a Torda or an Av. If it's within the same category, the subcategory is the same as the primary category. The rabbis say you bring one korban because it's the same category. Rav Eliezer says you bring two korban chatas because he said the only difference between the Av and the Torda is the one's merely historical. But what we can deduce from Gemara and Shabbos is that the Av and the Torda's primary and subcategory are the same in terms of the punishment, whether it's done on purpose or accidentally. With Tuma, in terms of the stringency, the subcategories are less stringent than the primary category. Why? Because there's a lower intensity of infection, of spiritual impurity, of Tuma. And therefore, you don't infect as many things being a subcategory of Tuma compared to a primary category of Tuma. The intensity is less. So Rav Papa is saying, with regards to Nezikin, is it that the subcategories are just as stringent with payment as the primary categories, or is it less stringent? And we're going to see. And the first thing when we did Keren is we said again, the subcategories of Keren are the same as the primary categories. And since the subcategories are the same as the primary in terms of intent, you are fully responsible for the same level of payment because it is your obligation to watch it. And should they do damage, it's your obligation to make financial restitution. Does that make sense, guys? So what we learn from this is a proof. We learn that it's not that so you want to say maybe with Tam, it doesn't make sense because with Tam you're actually paying half damages from the gufa of the animal. But let me remind you, that Tam and Muad has to do with habitually how often the animal is damaged. And since in that case, both the Av and the Torda are subject to Tam and Muad, it's not that the Torda are subject to Tam and the Av is subject to Muad. Both the acts of goring, which is a Av Malacha, can be Tam if the animal has not done it habitually and it's 3 times or less. The animal's tam, so it's half payment from the gufa of the animal, from the body of the animal. So that occurs, that leniency, even if it's an Av. And it occurs even if it's a Torda. So the less payment is not because it's a Torda compared to the Av. It's because the animal is not forewarned, Murat, but it is still considered tame because it hasn't become its nature to go. And this occurs whether it's a Torda, a subcategory, or an Av, which is a primary category. Does that make sense, guys?
Yep.
All right, we've done the first Av. Congratulations.
Yeah.
I think the summary was very important.
Back to you.
Okay. I think we needed it. All right, guys.